It's Wednesday, October 1st, Thursday the 2nd in the West Pacific, and we've got two systems to discuss today. We've got Hurricane Imelda, now very close to Bermuda, and forecast to pass directly over or very close to the island later tonight and bring strong hurricane force winds of potentially in excess of 100 miles per hour as it passes through tonight. And in the Western Pacific, Philippine Sea to be more specific, we've got Tropical Storm 27 forming here, Philippine named Paolo, which is forecast to intensify into a severe tropical storm or a typhoon as it approaches Luzon throughout the day today and makes landfall sometime tomorrow morning. And after that, it will enter the South China Sea, where we're likely to see some re-intensification occur, and we could see the system be a typhoon again as it approaches southern China later this weekend. We're going to start off in the Atlantic with Hurricane Imelda, and this has been a very fascinating past few days across the Western Atlantic, not just because of the interaction between Humberto and Imelda, but also seeing, especially today, how Imelda has been interacting with non-tropical features that are present today in this part of the Atlantic. Now, speaking to Humberto, the system is now gone. It's no longer a tropical cyclone. It has now merged with a cold front that is sitting in the far North Atlantic by this point. So we're sitting here now left with Hurricane Imelda, and the system is quickly approaching Bermuda from the west. And we've seen the system intensify steadily over the past few days. Like we talked about a couple of days ago, it likely was not going to rapidly intensify over the past couple of days, more so just steadily intensify. And we've seen that happen. The system has become a hurricane, and recon earlier today found that the system had winds of about 100 miles per hour, making this a Category 2 hurricane. And it's possible that we do still see the system intensify a little bit as we see the favorable interaction with non-tropical features continue. The first one that's most prevalent on the visible imagery in turning into infrared overnight is that we have a very strong jet streak in place across the far North Atlantic, well north of Bermuda. And that is where the flow is accelerating to strong speeds at the top of the troposphere. I can highlight this if we look at the GFS upper level wind plot. This red L here is Imelda, and you can see just north of that we've got all this green, yellow, and red coloring showing a jet streak here, or the acceleration of the flow at the top of the troposphere. And we've seen systems several times, especially in the Atlantic over the past few years, interact with jets in a similar way to this. And it's been very interesting in those cases to see how it impacts a tropical cyclone. Because if we look at Imelda right now and where it's positioned, it's sitting practically in the middle of the subtropical jet, which runs right through here. And in a normal circumstance, you would expect that to shear the system apart, and you would expect it not to intensify too much because it's under the influence of strong vertical shear. But instead, today, we've seen the system intensify into a Category 2 hurricane. Now, part of the lessening of the impacts of vertical shear has to do with the system moving at a fairly brisk pace, which I'll mention more in a moment when we're talking about impacts to Bermuda, as that is a good thing. So that does decrease some of the impacts of the vertical shear because you have stronger flow in the low levels of the atmosphere, causing the system to track faster. So it's not as strong of a vertical shear as it would be if the surface flow was not as strong. But there is still some vertical shear here, and yet we're seeing the system still intensify beyond Category 2 intensity. And one culprit of that is the jet streak that we have up north here. And one thing this jet streak does is it enhances the poleward outflow channel off to the north of the tropical cyclone. And this outflow channel is key to an intensifying tropical cyclone, as through the convective process in the core, it releases a lot of latent heat energy through the convective process. And that latent heat needs to be released out into the atmosphere to have an efficient process in the TC core. And what this allows with this more effective outflow is a more efficient release of the latent heat, and allows, in turn, a more effective convective process in the center of the hurricane. And now what that also does is it provides more upper level outflow around the hurricane. So you can see that we have upper level outflow expanding onto the west of the hurricane. And you can think of this as it's kind of building a wall between itself and the flow from the subtropical jet, decreasing the vertical shear that may impart upon the vortex of the hurricane, allowing the system to intensify like we've seen today. Now, it's not fully intensifying because of tropical processes. There's also some non-tropical characteristics in play here. And the other non-tropical feature that it's interacting with is a cold front just north of Bermuda. If I highlight this area of the Atlantic, and it's partially as well tied to Humberto, you'll note that we have this little line of clouds going towards the center of the storm like this. And this denotes a little area of convergence, which is a boundary between warm, unstable air and cooler and more stable air off to the north. So by definition, that's a cold front sitting in here like this. And this is getting rather close to the hurricane, as we've seen in scatterometer data. And you can also see this if we look at the HAFS model, which is a high resolution hurricane model, out to this afternoon. And you can see the boundary right about here, denoted by the southerly winds and northerly winds converging to one spot. So this is that frontal boundary here. And so we have now this contrast between warm air on the south side and cold air onto the north side. And this is making interesting changes to the wind profile that we normally see for a hurricane at this strength. Normally, by this point, you would expect the hurricane to have a more symmetric ball of purple here, or ball of hurricane force winds surrounding the eye. But instead, we have a very lopsided structure with the strongest winds on this model depicted on the western and southwestern side of the hurricane. And this is also much different to what you normally have for an Atlantic hurricane. On average, Atlantic hurricanes have their strongest winds take place on the northern side of the hurricane's eye. And so what's happening here? Well, by definition, tropical cyclones are a warm chord. So there's a lot of warm air in the center of the hurricane. That's why in intensifying hurricanes where we have recon, you may hear people refer to the temperature spike that the recon plane found in the center of the hurricane. Now, we have this warm core meeting up against all this cold air on the backside of this cold front. So now we have the stark temperature difference between the backside of the front and the warm TC core. And that zone in between causes a strong fetch of flow, or wind in this case, on the backside of the hurricane. And so we have a strong fetch of hurricane force winds on the backside of the hurricane. And this kind of a structure is forecast to remain the case throughout the night hours tonight. And so that's important going forward for Bermuda, is that the first half of the hurricane may not seem all too bad. It's probably just going to be tropical storm force winds for the most part. But once you pass the eye of the hurricane and go into the western side of it, it's probably going to be a very ugly side of the hurricane going throughout the night hours tonight. And you'll see this depicted here on the model overnight. This is out to 11 p.m. local time. And by this point, the hurricane is getting very close to the island of Bermuda. And you'll see that in the area that the system is getting, or the island is getting impacted by, it's not all too strong, not all too much stronger than what we've been feeling over the past couple of days from Humberto. But once we get to the western side of the eye, that very strong hurricane force wind field comes in, and it's going to be very strong. It's going to be a very potent side of the hurricane. And not only is that going to cause power outages and potential damage, but also going to lead to a lot of strong onshore push for a time onto the northern side of the island, which could lead to rapid water rises in the form of storm surge. And the damage could even be made worse because we have had strong gusty winds up to tropical storm force because of Humberto passing close by to the west. So trees may be a little bit weaker than they normally would be by this point. And so when this hurricane force wind field blows in, it may cause a lot of trees to come down, which could lead to damage to homes, property, and power outages across the island. And that's a significant potential that we'll have to watch here as this system's eye comes through tonight. Now, I did mention the system is moving at a fairly brisk pace, and that's a good thing for Bermuda. And the reason for that is because you'll note that the hurricane force wind field is not all too thick. So with the system moving pretty fast, that means that this wind field is not going to last over the island for too long. You'll see it starts around, say 1 or 2 a.m. local time, and then by 5 a.m., 4 or 5 a.m., it's gone. And the strongest winds are now well east of the island and continuously getting further east away from the island. And conditions by that point will improve rapidly. And so that's the one bit of good news here, is that the system is tracking fast enough to where it's not going to prolong the hurricane force winds across the island over the night tonight. And you'll see that as we go into the morning hours and into the afternoon hours on Thursday, the storm gets even further away from the island. In fact, it's off your screen by this point, and that will show, if the view was further west, that winds overall for Bermuda are getting much better across the island. So the impacts from both Humberto and Imelda will begin to die down fully. But first, we got to get through tonight with the hurricane force winds. And as you would expect, a hurricane warning is in effect for the island tonight as the system passes through. And you'll note that the tropical storm force wind field is already encroaching upon the island by this point. So it's too dangerous outside now to make any preparations ahead of the storm. So by this point, the best thing to do on the island is to hunker down as the system comes through tonight. And you see, again, with the fast forward motion, by tomorrow afternoon, it's well east of you all. So by that point, the damage will be done, and then we can begin recovery. And hopefully it's not all too bad in Bermuda. Bermuda tends to be pretty good at preparing for hurricanes, but nonetheless, when you get a strong hurricane hit like this, which is uncommon for Bermuda, it still can cause a lot of damage no matter how much you prepare. And beyond this part of the forecast, it will become a non-tropical cyclone. And it's not forecast to get all too close to Atlantic Canada, so not expecting much impacts there, as it just remains a non-tropical cyclone in the far North Atlantic. That's all that I've got for Hurricane Imelda. We're now going to move to the Western Atlantic, or the Western Pacific, sorry, Philippine Sea to be more specific, as we have Tropical Storm 27, Philippine named Paolo, which is developing today and is forecast to intensify into a severe tropical storm or typhoon as it approaches the coast of the Philippines later today and into early tomorrow. Now, if we take a look at how the system is doing as the sun rises, I'll go back here to the infrared loop so we see a little bit easier what the system is doing. And what we'll see is we can get a little bit of a sense of the system trying to form the classic curved band pattern in the center of the storm. That's where you have this curved band of thunderstorms wrapping around into the center of the storm like so. And this is so common because this often precludes a phase of quicker intensification, because what this does is it can help wrap convection around the center of the storm like this and close off an eye and eye wall structure. And if conditions are favorable and this process completes, the system can begin to intensify at a quicker rate. And looking at the environment surrounding the storm, we see that we have a very favorable environment overall. Much in difference to Buoloy last week, we don't have a strong patch of northeasterly flow across the Philippine Sea this week. In fact, we actually have a lot of clockwise flow instead, showing you low shear in general across this part of the Philippine Sea, and that's directly on top of the storm today. And this is forecast to persist over the next couple of days as it tracks west-northwest, and models are in general agreement that the system will intensify as it approaches the landmass going into our Friday. And you'll see this on the GFS. I'll go back to initialization. Again, you can see the favorable environment with this general clockwise turning aloft, showing you that low shear environment aloft of the system. And you'll see that as we go throughout the day today and into early tomorrow, this red number showing you the pressure begins to fall, showing you intensification in the center of the storm. And this is likely getting to typhoon intensity by the time it makes landfall, which is on early Friday by this point, getting into late morning, early afternoon on our Friday. Now, beyond this point, the system will be passing over the high terrain of Luzon by that point, and so we'll likely need some recuperation time over the South China Sea, which typically takes about 12 to 24 hours to occur. Now, exactly how long that takes is going to depend partly on how far north or south the system tracks. You'll see the GFS does take this fairly far north. It takes it on the northern end of Luzon, and that might be a scenario where we don't need as much recuperation time over the South China Sea. And so we'll see that, say 12 hours later, after it comes offshore, we begin to see the pressure lower again by that point, showing the system has recuperated itself. But if it comes further south into the northern Philippines, we may see the system center disrupted a little bit more, and so that may cause the system to take a little bit more time across the South China Sea as it approaches southern China. Now, regardless, the environment afterwards does look generally favorable for re-intensification to occur. Now, one thing to note is that we do have a little bit of an upper low that's backing towards the west as this storm tracks towards southern China, and this may impart some northerly shear upon the vortex as we get closer to China. And so that may be the reason why the GFS is not showing very rapid strengthening occur here. Another thing also may be that the waters here have been upwelled some with Ragasa a couple of weeks ago. If we look at the sea surface temperature map here across the Pacific, you'll see that across this zone in the northern South China Sea, the waters are now cooler, generally around 28 to 29 degrees Celsius. And yes, that is still plenty warm, but as I mentioned a lot with Regasa, the depth that that warm extends below the surface drops off a lot as you get towards the southern coast of China. So, with the upwelling that we've seen from Regasa a couple of weeks ago, that will make it very easy for 27 to upwell cooler waters as it nears the southern coast of China. And so the combination of that shear and this upwelling may well be the reason why we're not seeing this model specifically show rapid intensification here. But it does still show re-intensification into a typhoon, which is certainly within the realm of possibility here, as wind shear is not forecast to be overwhelmingly strong. It will likely be in the moderate threshold, which the system can overcome and still intensify in the face of. So the expectation this week is, again, a typhoon, severe tropical storm or typhoon coming into the Philippines by our Friday. And then as we go throughout this weekend and possibly into early next week on the slower solutions, we're likely to see a typhoon approach southern China. Exact landfall spot is uncertain as is natural at this range, as most right now range from just southwest of Hong Kong to Hainan, and we'll work out those specific details over the next few days. But for now, this is the current forecast from Pagasta, showing a similar evolution to what I just described there. You can see it becoming a severe tropical storm before making landfall in the Philippines early on Friday. They don't explicitly show it becoming a typhoon here in this forecast, but it might just be that it becomes one in between forecast points here. As you can see, one is well offshore and one is inland here. But regardless, it will likely be near typhoon intensity as it comes into the Philippines. And then beyond that, we see the system enter the South China Sea and re-intensify into a typhoon as it passes northwest closer to China. And beyond the landfall in China, we could also see some interaction to northern Vietnam, but the strength of the system does depend on how far north or south the system is. If it's further north, that would also mean less impacts because the system is further away from Vietnam. So those details that we need to still iron out will make a big difference in who gets the exact impacts of the system. But just keep in mind that we have unfortunately, another typhoon likely incoming here in this part of the world this week. And this would make 3 in the past few weeks. So that's all that I've got for these two systems. That will be my last video on Hurricane Imelda as it's turning post-tropical later on tomorrow, and the impacts as well to land are now ending for that system. So we'll be primarily focusing on 27 as we go throughout the next several days. But stay safe in Bermuda as Imelda passes through tonight. That's all that I've got for now. Thanks for watching.